Draw this on your wrist tonight. Forbidden Hebrew wealth key. Instant. I still remember the smell of iron and cedar in my grandfather Ezekias's workshop, the way sawdust clung to the morning light like gold suspended in amber, and how his hands, cracked and darkened by decades of labor, could shape a piece of wood into something that looked like it had always existed, like God had simply hidden it inside the grain, and Ezekias was just the one patient enough to find it. He never talked about money the way other men did. He never chased it, never complained about its absence, never boasted when it arrived. He treated wealth the way a river treats water, not as something to be hoarded, but as something that flows through, shaped by the terrain of who you are. I was 23 when he died. I was also, at that precise moment, 4 months behind on rent, surviving on rice and a stubborn refusal to ask anyone for help. The irony of inheriting a leather-bound journal from a man whose entire philosophy revolved around abundance, while I was that broke, was not lost on me. His name in the village records was actually Yehezkel, though everyone called him Ezekias. He was born in a mountain town so small it doesn't appear on modern maps, somewhere between what used to be called the Fertile Crescent and the dream of it. He emigrated twice, once from his country, once from his first identity, and somewhere in that double crossing, he picked up something that no customs officer ever thought to confiscate: a way of reading the world. The journal he left me was written in 3 languages: Portuguese in the margins, Arabic in the footnotes, and in the body of every 3rd entry, Hebrew. I did not speak Hebrew. I barely spoke Portuguese with any elegance at the time. Arabic was entirely beyond me. But the drawings were universal. On page 47, between an entry about the price of raw timber in 1974 and a recipe for something called harissa de tamarindo, there was a symbol. It was not complicated. It looked, at first glance, like a letter being eaten by a spiral, or a spiral being born from a letter. Depending on how long you stared at it, and I stared at it for an embarrassingly long time that first night, it shifted between these 2 readings without ever settling on one. Below the symbol, in his slanted Portuguese handwriting, Ezekias had written, "This is not magic. This is memory. The body remembers what the mind refuses to believe." I had no idea what that meant. I was 23, behind on rent, and holding a dead man's riddle. I traced the symbol onto my wrist with a ballpoint pen, mostly because I was tired and slightly delirious, and it seemed like something to do. Then I went to sleep. What followed over the next several years was not a miracle. I want to be precise about this because the story of what actually happened is more interesting than a miracle, and I have a horror of dishonesty dressed up in mystical clothing. What followed was a slow, grinding, occasionally humiliating education in the mechanics of attention. I got better at my work. I was a freelance translator at the time, converting technical documents from one language into another, a job that paid in the currency of invisible effort. The clients I worked with were not generous. The industry was not forgiving. But something shifted after that night, and I am still not entirely sure how to name it precisely. The closest I can come is this. I started noticing things I had trained myself not to notice. I noticed, for instance, that I consistently underpriced my services, not because I lacked confidence, but because I was unconsciously punishing myself for some crime I could never quite identify. I noticed that I avoided certain clients, not because they were difficult, but because their success made me feel small. I noticed that every time money was about to arrive, I found a sophisticated reason to delay or destroy it. These were not spiritual revelations, they were operational observations. But making them changed everything. There is a principle embedded in Kabbalistic thought, and I say this not as a practitioner because I am not, but as someone who eventually learned enough Hebrew to read his grandfather's entries, that wealth is not primarily a material phenomenon. It is, according to this framework, a matter of tzimtzum, a word that translates roughly as contraction or withdrawal. The idea is this: before creation, God withdrew, contracted, to make space for the world to exist. Abundance in this reading is not about filling yourself. It is about making space. It is about becoming the kind of vessel that can hold something without crushing it. Ezekiel understood this in his bones, I think, long before he could have articulated it. His workshop was never cluttered. He never held on to a project longer than it needed to stay. He was generous with his knowledge in a way that made younger craftsmen flock to him, and this generosity always seemed to return to him in forms he never directly sought. He made space. Wealth found its way into the space he made. I was doing the opposite. I was filling every available hour with anxiety about money, and in doing so, leaving no room for money to actually arrive and be recognized. The symbol on page 47 is, as best as I have been able to reconstruct from his notes and from later research, a variant of the letter Shin, the 21st letter of the Hebrew alphabet, wound around a spiral that bears resemblance to ancient notations found in texts from the school of Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, the 16th century Kabbalist from Safed, who systematized much of what is now understood as practical mysticism in the Jewish tradition. The Shin is associated with several things, depending on which layer of the tradition you're reading. It is the first letter of Shaddai, one of the names of God, which appears on mezuzot and is often translated as Almighty, but which Lurianic Kabbalists read more subtly as something like the one who says enough, the divine principle that sets limits on chaos, that draws the line between the flood and the shore. It is also the first letter of Shalom, peace, and Shekel, which is not merely a currency but a unit of weight, a measure of value, a standard against which other things are compared. And it is the first letter of Shema, the foundational declaration of Jewish faith, the prayer that begins, "Hear, O Israel," which is less a theological statement than an epistemological one, an instruction about the kind of attention you owe to the world. Hear, pay attention, notice what is actually here. I drew the symbol on my wrist every night for 3 months after finding it in the journal. I am aware of how this sounds. I am aware that there is no peer-reviewed literature supporting the neurological efficacy of drawing ancient letters on your skin before bed. What I can tell you is what I observed, with whatever fidelity I can bring to the description. The act of drawing the symbol slowed me down. It required a kind of deliberate attention, the pen moving carefully, the shape requiring precision, the process demanding that I stop whatever mental noise I had been generating and become, for 60 seconds, simply someone drawing a shape. That 60 seconds of quiet became, over weeks, a habit of pausing. The pausing created space in which I started to notice things I had previously bulldozed past in my anxiety. And the noticing, the actual operational, practical noticing, changed the decisions I made the next morning. I stopped underpricing. I cut clients who made me feel small. I started investing the difference between what I had been charging and what I now charged into a small brokerage account, which I tended with the same quality of attention I had learned to bring to everything else. By the time I was 27, I was no longer behind on rent. By the time I was 31, I owned the apartment. None of this happened because of the symbol. I want to be clear about that. Stubbornly, insistently clear. Because I think the version of this story that credits a drawing with financial transformation is both incorrect and deeply condescending. It treats people as though they need to be fooled into self-awareness. The symbol was a technology of attention. That is the only honest description I can give it. Ezekias understood this. There is an entry from 1982 in the journal. He would have been in his mid-50s then, where he writes in that triple language architecture of his, "The mark on the skin is not the point. The mark on the mind is the point. But we are animals before we are philosophers, and the skin teaches the mind things the mind is too proud to learn directly." This is, I think, one of the most practically useful things I have ever read. We are animals before we are philosophers. The body is not a vehicle for the intellect. It is a participant in cognition. What you do with your hands shapes what you believe. What you write on your skin, literally, physically, with the specific neural pathways activated by motor movement, encodes differently than what you merely think. Ritual is not superstition. Ritual is a technology for using the body to teach the mind. The ancient practitioners who encoded these symbols knew this. They were not performing magic. They were performing a very sophisticated form of cognitive training, calibrated to the limitations of human attention. My grandfather had a friend named Absalau, who visited the workshop occasionally throughout my childhood. Absalau was the only man I ever met who seemed genuinely indifferent to what other people thought of him. Not in the aggressive, performative way of someone who has decided not to care, but in the natural, structural way of someone who simply never needed the validation to begin with. He was not wealthy in any conventional sense. He drove a vehicle that should have been retired during the previous decade. He wore the same 4 shirts in rotation. But he moved through the world with a quality of ease that most wealthy people I have since met would have paid almost anything to acquire. I once asked Ezekias what Absalau's secret was. He looked at me for a moment with the expression he used when he thought I was asking the wrong question. And then he said, "Absalau knows the difference between what he needs and what he thinks he needs. Most people never figure out the difference. So they spend their whole lives trying to fill a hole with the wrong material and wondering why the hole doesn't close." I wrote that down. I did not understand it for another decade. The shin wound in a spiral, the specific form Ezekias drew on page 47, appears in a handful of texts from the Lurianic tradition as a notation for what is sometimes translated as ayin, meaning nothingness, or more precisely, the creative void. The state of potentiality that precedes manifestation. This is the same root that gives us the Kabbalistic concept of Ein Sof, the infinite, the boundless, the without end, that precedes even the beginning. In practical terms, the tradition uses this symbol not as a magical implement, but as a mnemonic, a physical anchor for a mental posture, the posture being, I am not my current conditions. I am not the account balance. I am not the closed door or the slow month or the failed negotiation. I am the space in which these things occur and from which something else can emerge. This is not the law of attraction. It is not the prosperity gospel. It is not wishful thinking dressed in ancient clothing. It is, if you strip away the metaphysical vocabulary, a description of a cognitive stance, the stance of someone who does not confuse their current reality with their permanent reality, the stance of someone who can experience scarcity without becoming scarcity. That distinction between experiencing a condition and becoming it is, I would argue, the single most practically important distinction in the entire domain of personal finance. There is a man I know now, I will call him Devenir, which is not his name, who made and lost 2 separate fortunes before the age of 40. Each time the fortune arrived, Devenir became it. He moved into the biggest available house. He surrounded himself with people whose respect he'd bought rather than earned. He made decisions from the posture of someone who was the fortune rather than someone who was hosting the fortune temporarily. When conditions changed, as conditions always do, and the fortune contracted, Devenir contracted with it. The identity he had built around the money collapsed with the money. He was not someone who had lost wealth. He was someone who had lost himself. I watched this happen twice. The second time I tried to say something about it. He looked at me with genuine incomprehension. "You don't understand what it's like to lose everything," he said. I did not argue. But I thought of Ezekias, who had left a country, rebuilt twice, and yet somehow never seemed to be losing anything, because he never seemed to have placed his identity anywhere it could be taken from him. I still have the journal. It lives on a shelf in my office between a dictionary of archaic Portuguese and a structural manual on load-bearing walls that I keep for reasons I can no longer entirely reconstruct. I still draw the symbol occasionally, not every night, not as a ritual with any mystical content, but as what I have come to think of as a calibration practice. 60 seconds of deliberate attention. 60 seconds of drawing a shape that requires care, that connects me to a man I loved, that reminds me of the specific posture I am trying to inhabit. The posture of someone who makes space. The posture of someone who knows the difference between what they are and what they currently have. The posture of someone who hears, in the Shema sense, the ancient paying attention sense, what is actually present, rather than the anxious projection of what might be absent. If you draw this symbol on your wrist tonight, and I mean this precisely, not as a provocation, nothing will happen. Nothing magical, nothing instant. No force in the universe will reroute money toward you because of marks on your skin. But here is what might happen, if you let it. You might slow down for 60 seconds. You might bring a quality of attention to those 60 seconds that you have not brought to the previous several hours. In that attention, you might notice something. A decision you've been avoiding, a price you've been accepting that you shouldn't, a story you've been telling yourself about why abundance is for other people. And if you notice that thing, if you actually see it, in the full Shema sense of seeing, then you have done something far more consequential than any ritual. You have interrupted the automation. You have created the space that Ezekias always talked about, the contraction that makes room for something to exist that couldn't exist before. The Hebrew letter Shin is not a key to a vault. It is a mirror. What it reflects back at you depends entirely on what you are willing to see. My grandfather understood that. He spent his life making things with his hands that would outlast him. Furniture, mostly, but also a journal, and a grandson who spent years learning what the journal was actually trying to say. The workshop smelled like iron and cedar. His hands were cracked and dark. He never chased money, and somehow he was never without enough. I used to think that was his secret. Now I think his secret was simpler and harder and more available to all of us than we want to admit. He paid attention. He made space. He knew the difference between himself and his conditions, and every morning before the light had fully broken over the mountain town that doesn't appear on modern maps, he sat for 60 seconds with something in his hands, a tool, a pencil, once a leather journal, and he practiced being the kind of person that wealth could find its way to. Not because wealth loved him, but because he had stopped blocking the door.